Question 1. Judicial review of administrative actions. During a major transformation where existing methods of agency decision-making are under scrutiny, a federal agency issues a rule that significantly impacts an industry. A trade association challenges the rule in federal court, arguing that the agency acted arbitrarily and capriciously under the Administrative Procedure Act (APA). The agency, in response, asserts that it had broad discretion, relied on expert judgment in developing the rule. In this situation, how should the court analyze whether the agency's rule withstands judicial scrutiny? A. The court should defer entirely to the agency's expertise and uphold the rule unless there is clear evidence of fraud or misconduct. B. The court should apply the Chevron deference test and determine whether the agency's interpretation of the law was reasonable. C. The court should evaluate whether the agency's action was arbitrary and capricious under PA SS 706-2A by examining whether the agency considered relevant factors and articulated rational connection between facts and its decision. D. The court should disregard the agency's justification and substitute its own judgment on the rule's reasonableness. Answer. C. The court should evaluate whether the agency's action was arbitrary and capricious under PA SS 706-2A. Explanation. Judicial review of agency rulemaking is governed by SS 706 of the Administrative Procedure Act (APA). The arbitrary and capricious standard is key ground for invalidating agency actions. Courts assess whether an agency considered all relevant factors before issuing rule, offered rational explanation based on evidence, avoided basing decisions on irrelevant considerations. Why not? A. Courts do not defer completely to an agency's expertise. While expertise matters, agencies must provide logical and reasoned justifications. Why not? B. Chevron deference applies primarily to agency interpretations of statutory ambiguity, not challenges to agency rulemaking under the arbitrary and capricious standard. Why not? D. Courts cannot replace agency decisions with their own policy preferences. Their role is reviewing the decision-making process for legal soundness. Relevant case law. Motor Vehicle Manufacturers Asand v. State Farm Mutual Auto Ins. Company, 1983, emphasized that agencies must provide reasoned explanation for their policy choices. Question 2. Procedural due process in administrative adjudication. While investigating inconsistencies across various units of a federal agency, an employee is terminated based on alleged misconduct. The employee was not given a formal hearing or an opportunity to present evidence before the decision was made. The agency argues that as a government employer, it has discretion to dismiss employees without full adjudication. The challenges the termination, asserting a violation of procedural due process. Under administrative law principles, what procedural protections is the employee entitled to? A. The employee is entitled to full adversarial trial proceedings, including discovery and cross-examination before any disciplinary action can be taken. B. The employee has no due process rights because employment decisions are discretionary and subject to termination. C. The employee is entitled to pre-termination notice and an opportunity to respond, followed by a post-termination hearing under Cleveland Board of Education v. Loudermill, 1985. D. The agency can impose immediate dismissal without any procedural protections as long as it documents its reasons. Answer. C. The employee is entitled to pre-termination notice and an opportunity to respond, followed by a post-termination hearing explanation. Under procedural due process principles, public employees with a protected property interest in their job, such as tenured employees or those covered by civil service protections, cannot be terminated without due process. Key due process requirements: pre-termination protections, notice of the charges, an opportunity to respond, post-termination hearing, a more detailed hearing to challenge the decision. Why not? A. Due process does not require a full trial before termination. A pre-termination opportunity to respond suffices. Why not? B. While employees may have fewer rights, government employment often creates a property interest, triggering due process requirements. Why not? D. Agencies cannot summarily dismiss employees without procedural safeguards, even if they document their reasons. Relevant case law. Cleveland Board of Education v. Loudermill, 1985, held that public employees with job protections must receive notice and a chance to be heard before termination. Question 3. Separation of powers and administrative law. During an emergency response where multiple areas are impacted, Congress passes a law delegating broad rulemaking authority to an executive agency, allowing it to define critical safety standards without specific congressional guidelines. A business group challenges the delegation, arguing that it violates the non-delegation doctrine by granting unchecked legislative power to the agency. The most likely judicial response to this challenge: A. The delegation is unconstitutional because only Congress has the power to create laws and agencies cannot be granted any rulemaking discretion. B. The delegation is constitutional under the intelligible principle standard as long as Congress provides general policy objectives for the agency to follow. C. The delegation is invalid because agencies cannot create rules affecting private businesses unless explicitly directed by Congress in instance. D. The delegation is unconstitutional unless the agency's rules are reviewed by the judiciary before implementation. Answer: B. The delegation is constitutional under the intelligible principle standard. Explanation: The non-delegation doctrine limits Congress's ability to transfer its legislative authority to executive agencies. However, the Supreme Court has upheld broad delegations as long as Congress provides an intelligible principle to guide the agency's discretion. Why not they? Absolute prohibition on delegation is not supported by precedent. Agencies routinely receive authority to make rules. Why not? C. Agencies can regulate private businesses as long as they operate within statutory framework provided by Congress. Why not? D. Judicial review occurs after rulemaking, not as prerequisite to delegation. Courts do not pre-approve agency actions. Relevant case law: J. W. Hampton, Union and Umpany v. United States, 1928, established the intelligible principle test, which permits delegation as long as agencies follow Congress's general guidance. Question 4. While analyzing the root causes of sequential problems in regulatory compliance, an administrative agency is facing challenges in enforcing a newly implemented rule regarding financial disclosures by large corporations. The agency has conducted multiple inspections and identified inconsistencies in how different companies are interpreting and applying the rule. Some businesses claim that the rule is vague, while others argue that it exceeds the agency's statutory authority. The agency is considering issuing an interpretative rule to clarify the regulation's intent and application. However, there is debate over whether the agency must follow formal rulemaking procedures under the Administrative Procedure Act, APA, or if an interpretative rule can bypass those requirements. Under what circumstances can an agency issue an interpretative rule without undergoing formal rulemaking, and what are the legal limits to such actions? A. The agency must always follow formal rulemaking for any rule, including interpretative rules, to ensure transparency and public participation. B. Interpretative rules do not require formal rulemaking because they merely clarify existing law and do not create new legal obligations. C. The agency can issue an interpretative rule without formal rulemaking, but if it imposes new obligations, it will be subject to judicial review and may be invalidated. D. Any agency rule, whether interpretative or substantive, must be subject to public comment period before taking effect. Answer: C. The agency can issue an interpretative rule without formal rulemaking, but if it imposes new obligations, it will be subject to judicial review and may be invalidated. Explanation: Under the Administrative Procedure Act, APA, Section 553, interpretative rules are exempt from the notice and comment rulemaking requirements because they do not establish new legal obligations, but rather explain or clarify laws or regulations. However, courts have consistently held that if an interpretative rule effectively creates new requirements, it can be challenged and potentially invalidated under judicial review. The Supreme Court in Perez v. Mortgage Bankers Association, 2015, reaffirmed that interpretative rules do not require notice and comment procedures but can still be scrutinized if they impose substantive changes. Option A is incorrect because formal rulemaking is only required for certain substantive rules, not interpretative ones. Option B is partially correct but fails to account for the fact that interpretative rules can still be challenged in court. Option D misstates the rulemaking process since public comment is generally not required for interpretative rules. Question 5. During an emergency response where multiple areas are impacted, a federal administrative agency has been granted temporary emergency powers to regulate critical resources such as water and energy distribution to ensure public safety. However, a private company challenges the agency's new directive, arguing that it violates procedural due process because no formal hearing was held before the rule was enforced. The argues that the urgency of the situation justifies bypassing the usual procedural requirements. Under what legal framework can an agency bypass normal due process requirements during an emergency, and what limits exist on such authority? A. The agency can bypass all procedural due process requirements during an emergency under the principle of sovereign immunity. B. The agency must still provide post-deprivation hearing even in emergency situations to comply with due process requirements. See under Matthews v. Eldridge. Due process can be flexible, and agencies may issue emergency orders without hearing if immediate action is necessary. D. Emergency actions by agencies are unconstitutional unless approved by Congress before implementation. Answer C. Under Matthews v. Eldridge, due process can be flexible, and agencies may issue emergency orders without a hearing if immediate action is necessary. Explanation: the Supreme Court in Matthews v. Eldridge, 1976, established a balancing test for determining due process requirements. The test considers the private interest affected by the government action, the risk of erroneous deprivation, and the probable value of additional procedural safeguards, and the government's interest, including administrative efficiency and public safety. In emergency situations, agencies are often permitted to take immediate action to protect public health safety. However, post-deprivation hearings, as stated in option B, are sometimes required depending on the circumstances. Option A is incorrect because sovereign immunity does not allow agencies to ignore constitutional rights. Option D is incorrect because agencies often have emergency authority under enabling statutes without requiring pre-approval from Congress. Question 6. When implementing new protocols in a shared environment, an independent regulatory agency has issued new rules affecting multiple industries. Some businesses challenged the rules, arguing that the agency exceeded its authority and that the rules should be invalidated under the Chevron and Skidmore deference doctrines. The court must now determine what level of deference to give to the agency's interpretation of the law. Under what circumstances would court apply Chevron deference versus Skidmore deference, and what are the key differences between these standards? A Chevron deference applies when statute is ambiguous and an agency's interpretation is reasonable. A Skidmore deference applies when the agency's interpretation is persuasive but not binding. B. Courts always apply Chevron deference because agencies have the most expertise in their specialized fields. C. Skidmore deference applies to all agency interpretations unless the Supreme Court explicitly rules otherwise. D. Both Chevron and Skid deference require strict judicial review process before applying any agency rule. Answer A. Chevron deference applies when a statute is ambiguous and an agency's interpretation is reasonable. A Skidmore deference applies when the agency's interpretation is persuasive but not binding. Explanation: the Supreme Court in Chevron U.S. v. Natural Resources, Defense Counsel, 1984, established that courts should defer to agency interpretations of ambiguous statutes as long as the interpretation is reasonable. This is known as Chevron deference and is applied in 2 steps. Is the statute ambiguous? If not, the court applies the statute as written. If ambiguous, is the agency's interpretation reasonable? If yes, the court defers to the agency. However, if an agency's interpretation is not entitled to Chevron deference, courts may apply Skidmore deference, which is based on the agency's persuasiveness, thoroughness, and reasoning. Skidmore v. Swift and Umpany, 1944. Option B is incorrect because Chevron is not always applied. Courts sometimes reject deference if the agency's interpretation is unreasonable. Option C is incorrect because Skidmore is not the default standard. Option D is incorrect because not all agency rules require strict judicial review. Question 7. During a critical transition period where existing processes are being restructured within an administrative agency, tensions arise between agency discretion and the requirements of procedural due process. The agency implements a new rule limiting the ability of affected individuals to request hearings before administrative law judges. Which of the following best describes the legal issue at play? A. The agency's rule is likely permissible if it follows proper notice and comment rulemaking under the Administrative Procedure Act (APAT). B. The agency's rule may violate due process requirements if it deprives individuals of meaningful opportunity to be heard. C. The agency's rule is enforceable because agencies have complete discretion over internal procedural modifications. D. The agency's rule is automatically void if it contradicts prior agency policies. Answer: B. The agency's rule may violate due process requirements if it deprives individuals of meaningful opportunity to be heard. Explanation: Administrative agencies have discretion in rulemaking, but they must comply with procedural due process as required by the Fifth and 14th Amendments. Under the Matthews v. Eldridge 1976 balancing test, procedural due process requires evaluating the private interest affected, the risk of erroneous deprivation and the value of additional safeguards, and the government's interest, including fiscal and administrative burdens. If limiting hearings results in significant deprivation of rights without meaningful alternative, the rule may be unconstitutional. Option A is incorrect because notice and comment rulemaking does not automatically validate rule that violates constitutional due process. Option C is incorrect because agency discretion is not absolute. Option D is incorrect because prior policies can be changed unless they create binding entitlements. Question 8. While investigating a complicated issue between different federal agencies, Congress determines that one agency has exceeded its statutory authority by implementing regulations that contradict legislative intent. Which judicial doctrine is most relevant in resolving this issue? A. The Chevron deference doctrine. B. The Skidmore deference doctrine. C. The major questions doctrine. D. The non-delegation doctrine. Answer. C. The major questions doctrine. Explanation. The major questions doctrine, established in cases such as West Virginia v. EPA 2022, holds that courts should not defer to an agency's interpretation of law when the issue is of vast economic or political significance unless Congress has explicitly delegated such authority. Option A, Chevron deference, applies when statutory ambiguity allows agencies to reasonably interpret laws they administer. Chevron U.S. A. v. ADC 1984. However, the major questions doctrine serves as an exception to Chevron when an issue is too significant to be left to agency discretion. Option B, Skidmore deference, is a weaker form of deference where courts consider agency expertise without being bound by it. Option D, non-delegation doctrine, is incorrect because while it limits excessive delegation of legislative power, it is not the primary doctrine for determining whether an agency exceeded its authority in interpreting existing law. Question 9. In a high-stakes environment where multiple challenges arise in administrative adjudication, an agency modifies its hearing procedures by shifting from live hearings with oaths to purely written submissions for all contested cases. Which constitutional principle is most relevant in assessing the validity of this change? A. The Appointments Clause of the U.S. Constitution. B. The right to cross-examine witnesses under administrative law. C. The Matthews v. Eldridge procedural due process test. D. The Equal Protection Clause. Answer. C. The Matthews v. Eldridge procedural due process test. Explanation. The agency's decision to eliminate live hearings implicates procedural due process under Matthews v. Eldridge 1976. Courts evaluate whether the new procedure adequately protects due process rights by balancing the importance of the individual's interest, the risk of erroneous deprivation, and the government's burden. Option A is incorrect because the Appointments Clause, Article Omen Tessesu, CL 2, concerns how odds are appointed, not the structure of hearings. Option B is partially relevant, but administrative law does not always require cross-examination unless due process demands it. Option D, equal protection, is not the best answer because the issue concerns procedural fairness rather than discriminatory treatment. Question 10. In a scenario where efficiency decreases across multiple administrative agencies due to conflicting regulations, a federal agency issues a binding interpretive rule clarifying the statutory language. A business affected by the rule challenges it in court, arguing that the agency failed to undergo formal notice and comment rulemaking. Which of the following best explains whether the agency's action is legally valid? A. The agency must follow notice and comment procedures because interpretive rules have the force of law. B. The agency's interpretive rule is invalid unless Congress explicitly authorized it. C. The agency is not required to use notice and comment rulemaking for interpretive rules under the Administrative Procedure Act, APAT. D. The agency's rule is automatically unenforceable if challenged in court. Answer. C. The agency is not required to use notice and comment rulemaking for interpretive rules under the Administrative Procedure Act, APAT. Explanation. Under the Administrative Procedure Act, APAT 5 U.S.C. SS 553 BA, agencies are generally required to follow notice and comment rulemaking for substantive, legislative rules, but not for interpretive rules. Interpretive rules clarify or explain existing law rather than creating new binding legal obligations. In Perez v. Mortgage Bankers Association, 2015, the Supreme Court reaffirmed that interpretive rules do not require formal rulemaking. Option A is incorrect because interpretive rules do not have the force of law like legislative rules. Option B is incorrect because agencies do not need explicit congressional authorization for interpretive rules as long as they are consistent with the statute. Option D is incorrect because courts do not automatically invalidate interpretive rules, but instead evaluate them for reasonableness and consistency with the statute. Question 11. While analyzing the root causes of sequential problems in administrative enforcement, a regulatory agency retroactively applies a new policy interpretation resulting in significant penalties for businesses. Which legal principle is most relevant in determining whether the retroactive application is permissible? A. The Our Deference Doctrine. B. The Principle Against Retroactive Rulemaking. C. The Chevron Deference Doctrine. D. The Non-Delegation Doctrine. Answer. B. The Principle Against Retroactive Rulemaking. Explanation. The principle against retroactive rulemaking prohibits agencies from applying new rules to past conduct unless Congress explicitly allows it. In Bowen v. Georgetown University Hospital, 1988, the Supreme Court ruled that agencies cannot impose retroactive regulations without clear statutory authority. Option A, Our Deference applies when courts defer to an agency's interpretation of its own regulations, not to retroactivity issues. Option C, Chevron deference, allows agencies to interpret ambiguous statutes prospectively, not retroactively. Option D, non-delegation doctrine, concerns whether Congress has improperly delegated legislative power to agencies but does not govern retroactivity. Question 12. In a high-stakes environment where multiple challenges emerge regarding administrative agency independence, Congress enacts a statute allowing the President to remove an independent agency head at will. What is the key legal issue at play? A. Whether the removal statute violates the separation of powers doctrine. B. Whether the agency head has standing to challenge the removal in court. C. Whether the statute violates the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment. D. Whether the President has inherent authority to remove agency heads without congressional approval. Answer. A. Whether the removal statute violates the separation of powers doctrine. Explanation. The removal power of the President over executive officials is a key separation of powers issue. In Sealer Law LLC at CAB 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that the President generally must have the ability to remove executive officers at will except for certain multi-member independent agencies such as the FTC. If Congress attempts to strip the President of removal power entirely, it likely violates the separation of powers doctrine. Option B is incorrect because while agency heads may challenge their removal, the constitutional issue takes precedence. Option C is incorrect because the takings clause applies to property, not executive removals. Option D is incorrect because presidential removal authority is subject to statutory limitations for certain independent agencies. Question 13. During an emergency response where multiple areas are impacted, an administrative agency is tasked with rapidly implementing new regulations to address the crisis. However, stakeholders argue that the agency has bypassed key procedural safeguards, such as public notice and comment. Which of the following legal principles best determines whether the agency's actions are lawful? A. The agency can always bypass notice and comment requirements in emergency situations. B. The agency must demonstrate that the emergency qualifies for good cause of exemption under the Administrative Procedure Act (APA). C. The agency's decision is automatically valid as long as it aligns with executive policy priorities. D. Stakeholders can challenge the agency's actions, but courts will defer to the agency's judgment without scrutiny. Answer. B. The agency must demonstrate that the emergency qualifies for a good cause of exemption under the Administrative Procedure Act (APA). Explanation. Under the Administrative Procedure Act (APA), Section 553(b) 3(b), agencies may bypass the usual notice and comment rulemaking if they can establish good cause that public participation would be impracticable, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest in emergent situations such as public health crises or natural disasters. Agencies often invoke this good cause exemption to implement regulations immediately. However, courts still review whether the agency's justification for skipping procedural safeguards was reasonable and legally sound. Option is incorrect because emergencies do not grant automatic authority to bypass rulemaking. The agency must justify its decision under APA guidelines. Option C is incorrect because executive policy priorities do not override statutory rulemaking requirements under the APA. Option D is incorrect because courts do not blindly defer to agency decisions in these cases. They assess whether the agency properly applied the good cause exemption. This question tests candidates' understanding of the balance between administrative efficiency and procedural due process, fundamental concept in emergency administrative law. Question 14. While managing a hybrid approach where timing issues affect enforcement, an agency struggles to implement new regulatory standards that conflict with older, still enforced regulations. What is the best legal approach for the agency to resolve this regulatory inconsistency? A. The agency should continue enforcing both regulations and let courts decide the validity of conflicts. B. The agency should issue a policy statement clarifying that the newer regulation supersedes the older one. C. The agency should follow formal rulemaking procedures to repeal or amend the conflicting regulation. D. The agency should suspend enforcement of all regulations until the issue is resolved. Answer. C. The agency should follow formal rulemaking procedures to repeal or amend the conflicting regulation. Explanation. Administrative agencies must ensure that new regulations do not contradict existing ones, as inconsistent enforcement can lead to legal uncertainty and challenges under the Administrative Procedure Act (APA). If the newly issued regulation conflicts with an older regulation, the agency must engage in full rulemaking, APA Section 553, to amend or repeal the outdated rule. Option is incorrect because courts generally defer to agencies to resolve internal regulatory conflicts rather than making initial decisions on enforcement. Option B is incorrect because policy statements lack binding legal authority and cannot repeal existing regulations. Option D is incorrect because suspending all enforcement would violate the agency's statutory duty to regulate under the Enabling Act. This question assesses rulemaking procedures and how agencies manage conflicts between new and existing regulations. Question 15. When implementing new protocols in a shared environment, an independent regulatory agency faces pressure from the executive branch to modify its enforcement approach. However, stakeholders argue that such changes would compromise the agency's independent decision-making. Under U.S. administrative law, what is the primary legal constraint on executive influence over independent agencies? A. The president can remove agency heads at will to enforce compliance with executive policies. B. Independent agencies have no constitutional protections from executive oversight. C. The president's ability to remove agency officials is typically limited by statutory provisions. D. The executive branch has complete discretion over independent agency rulemaking. Answer. C. The president's ability to remove agency officials is typically limited by statutory provisions. Explanation. Independent agencies are structured to operate with insulation from direct executive control, often established by Congress through enabling statutes. Key legal precedent is Humphrey's Executive v. United States, 1935, which held that the president cannot remove independent agency officials at will unless authorized by statute. G. For cause. Option is incorrect because independent agency heads often have removal protections that prevent the president from firing them at will. Option B is incorrect because independent agencies do have constitutional protections derived from their enabling statutes. Option D is incorrect because the executive branch does not control independent agency rulemaking, though it may influence it through policy guidance. This question helps candidates understand the separation of powers in administrative law and the role of independent agencies. Question 16. In a situation where formal requirements conflict with practical enforcement challenges, a federal agency issues a regulation that requires businesses to report detailed environmental impact data quarterly. However, due to technological and logistical constraints, many regulated entities struggle to comply. What legal mechanism can the agency use to balance enforcement with feasibility? A. Rely on strict statutory enforcement and penalize all non-compliant entities. B. Issue a non-binding guidance document that clarifies flexible compliance expectations. C. Use administrative adjudication to resolve compliance cases individually. D. Grant a blanket waiver for all businesses that claim compliance difficulties. Answer. B. Issue a non-binding guidance document that clarifies flexible compliance expectations. Explanation. When formal regulatory requirements create practical enforcement difficulties, agencies often use guidance documents to provide clarifications, interpretations, or enforcement flexibilities. These documents do not carry the force of law but help agencies balance compliance expectations with practical realities. Option is incorrect because strict enforcement without considering feasibility could lead to widespread non-compliance and legal challenges. Option C is incorrect because administrative adjudication is typically case-specific and does not provide broad policy solutions. Option D is incorrect because agencies cannot issue blanket waivers unless authorized by the enabling statute. This question assesses knowledge of agency discretion and enforcement flexibility under administrative law. Question 17. When scaling up operations that experience significant procedural inefficiencies, a regulatory agency implements a new data-driven inspection system. However, some affected industries challenge the system, arguing that it results in unfair enforcement disparities. What legal principle is most relevant in evaluating whether the agency's new approach is valid? A. The non-delegation doctrine. B. The arbitrary and capricious standard under the APA. C. The Chevron deference principle. D. The major questions doctrine. Answer. B. The arbitrary and capricious standard under the APA. Explanation. Under the Administrative Procedure Act APA, Section 706(2)(a), agency actions can be struck down if they are arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion, or otherwise not in accordance with law. When an agency significantly changes its enforcement approach, courts review whether the change is based on reasoned decision-making and adequate justification. Option is incorrect because the non-delegation doctrine applies to Congress delegating power to agencies, not agency enforcement approaches. Option C is incorrect because Chevron deference applies to statutory interpretation, not agency enforcement methods. Option D is incorrect because the major questions doctrine is invoked when agencies regulate issues of vast economic or political significance without clear congressional authorization. This question tests understanding of judicial review of agency actions under the APA. Question 18. During a major transformation where existing methods no longer meet regulatory standards, a federal agency implements a broad policy shift. However, the change imposes significant compliance costs on industries. What legal doctrine determines whether the agency's policy shift is valid despite the economic burden? A. The doctrine of exhaustion of administrative remedies. B. The substantial evidence standard. C. The principle of reasoned decision-making under State Farm. D. The procedural due process requirement. Answer. C. The principle of reasoned decision-making under State Farm. Explanation. In Motor Vehicle Manufacturers Association v. State Farm, 1983, the Supreme Court held that agencies must provide reasoned explanations for significant policy changes. The agency must analyze relevant factors, address counter-arguments, and ensure the shift is not arbitrary or capricious. Option is incorrect because exhaustion of administrative remedies applies to challenges requiring petitioners to go through agency procedures before judicial review. Option B is incorrect because the substantial evidence standard applies mainly to formal rulemaking and adjudication, not broad policy shifts. Option D is incorrect because procedural due process protections apply to individual rights, not general regulatory shifts. This question examines administrative law principles regarding policy changes and judicial review. Question 19. While analyzing the root causes of sequential problems in regulatory enforcement, an agency identifies outdated statutory language as the primary barrier. However, the agency lacks authority to amend the law directly. What is the most appropriate course of action for the agency? A. Issue a formal rule overriding the outdated statute. B. Petition Congress for legislative amendments. C. Enforce the statute as written, regardless of practical difficulties. D. Interpret the statute flexibly, even if the interpretation contradicts legislative intent. Answer. B. Petition Congress for legislative amendments. Explanation. Administrative agencies cannot unilaterally change statutory law. They must work within the framework established by Congress. If statutory language is outdated or problematic, agencies typically propose legislative changes or request clarifications from Congress. Option is incorrect because agencies cannot override statutes through rulemaking. Option C is incorrect because strict enforcement of outdated laws may lead to inefficiencies and unintended consequences. Option D is incorrect because Chevron deference does not permit agencies to contradict clear congressional intent. This question reinforces the relationship between agencies and Congress in lawmaking. Question 20. In an environment where different components must interact under evolving regulatory requirements, a state agency introduces a new system for handling compliance disputes. However, affected businesses argue that the new process denies them fair participation. Under administrative law, what principle is most relevant in evaluating whether the agency's new system is legally sound? A. The rational basis test. B. The due process clause of the Fifth or 14th Amendment. C. The Chevron deference standard. D. The rule of lenity. Answer: B. The due process clause of the Fifth or 14th Amendment. Explanation: procedural due process under the Fifth and 14th Amendments requires that individuals and businesses be given notice and an opportunity to be heard before the government takes action that affects their rights. Agencies must ensure that their compliance dispute systems include fair procedures and do not arbitrarily deny participation. Option is incorrect because the rational basis test applies to legislative actions, not administrative processes. Option C is incorrect because Chevron deference applies to statutory interpretation, not due process claims. Option D is incorrect because the rule of lenity applies to criminal statutes, not regulatory procedures. This question tests knowledge of due process requirements in administrative enforcement. Question 21. In a high-stakes environment where multiple challenges arise simultaneously, a federal agency introduces a new regulatory framework to improve cybersecurity compliance. However, businesses argue that the new regulations impose excessive costs and hinder innovation. What legal principle should be applied to assess the validity of the agency's actions? A. The Chevron deference standard. B. The major questions doctrine. C. The rational basis test. D. The strict scrutiny standard. Answer: B. The major questions doctrine. Explanation: the major questions doctrine applies when an agency takes economically or politically significant actions without clear congressional authorization. Courts may invalidate the regulation if Congress did not explicitly delegate such broad authority to the agency. Option is incorrect because Chevron deference applies when agencies interpret ambiguous statutory provisions, but it does not override major questions concerns. Option C is incorrect because the rational basis test applies mainly to constitutional challenges against laws, not agency regulations. Option D is incorrect because strict scrutiny applies to fundamental rights cases, not administrative rulemaking. This question evaluates understanding of judicial review of agency authority in significant regulatory matters. Question 22. While managing a hybrid approach where timing issues complicate implementation, a state environmental agency adopts new pollution control measures. However, the agency delays enforcement due to industry concerns. Can the agency's delay in enforcement be legally challenged? A. No, because agencies have discretion in enforcing regulations. B. Yes, if the delay is deemed arbitrary and capricious under the APA. C. No, because enforcement policies are not subject to judicial review. D. Yes, if the delay violates due process rights of affected parties. Answer: B. Yes, if the delay is deemed arbitrary and capricious under the APA. Explanation: under the Administrative Procedure Act APA, agencies must justify delays in enforcement to avoid being deemed arbitrary and capricious. If an agency fails to provide a reasoned explanation for postponing enforcement, affected parties may challenge the delay in court. Option is incorrect because agencies cannot delay enforcement indefinitely without justification. Option C is incorrect because certain enforcement policies can be reviewed if they lead to unfair regulatory outcomes. Option D is incorrect because due process challenges typically involve deprivations of individual rights, which is not the primary issue here. This question tests knowledge of agency discretion and enforcement obligations under administrative law. Question 23. When developing a solution that must address opposing needs, a regulatory body introduces new financial reporting standards that aim to enhance transparency while minimizing compliance burdens. However, some stakeholders claim the rules are vague and open to interpretation. What doctrine governs judicial review of the agency's interpretation of its own regulations? A. Chevron deference. B. Our deference. C. The non-delegation doctrine. D. The major questions doctrine. Answer: B. Our deference. Explanation: under our deference, from Our v. Robbins, 1997, Courts defer to an agency's interpretation of its own regulations as long as the interpretation is reasonable and does not conflict with the regulation's plain meaning. Option is incorrect because Chevron deference applies to statutory interpretation, not agency interpretations of their own rules. Option C is incorrect because the non-delegation doctrine concerns Congress delegating legislative powers, not agency rule interpretation. Option D is incorrect because the major questions doctrine applies to broad economic or political decisions, not standard regulatory interpretations. This question evaluates understanding of judicial deference to agency interpretations. Question 24. During an emergency response where multiple areas are impacted, an agency issues immediate temporary restrictions on resource use. Some businesses argue the restrictions exceed the agency's statutory authority. What legal principle is most relevant in determining the validity of the agency's emergency action? A. The doctrine of necessity. B. The arbitrary and capricious standard under the APA. C. The doctrine of exhaustion of administrative remedies. D. The substantial evidence standard. Answer. B. The arbitrary and capricious standard under the APA. Explanation. Agencies can take emergency actions, but these actions must be justified and not arbitrary or capricious. Under the APA, courts review whether the agency provided a rational explanation and considered relevant factors before imposing restrictions. Option is incorrect because the doctrine of necessity applies mainly to criminal and constitutional law, not administrative rulemaking. Option C is incorrect because exhaustion of remedies applies when petitioners must seek administrative relief before going to court. Option D is incorrect because the substantial evidence standard applies to formal adjudications, not emergency actions. This question assesses judicial review of emergency regulatory measures. Question 25. In a scenario where efficiency decreases across multiple divisions, a government agency implements a new internal policy requiring more documentation for approvals. Employees challenge the policy as overly burdensome. Under administrative law, what factor determines whether the policy is legally enforceable? A. Whether it was subject to public notice and comment rulemaking. B. Whether it is a legally binding rule or a non-binding guidance document. C. Whether it is consistent with statutory intent. D. Whether it has economic justification. Answer. B. Whether it is a legally binding rule or a non-binding guidance document. Explanation. Internal agency policies are typically considered non-binding guidance unless they carry the force of law. Courts assess whether the policy creates new legal obligations, which would require formal rulemaking procedures under the APA. Option is incorrect because notice and comment procedures apply to formal regulations, not internal policies. Option C is incorrect because statutory intent matters for formal regulations, but not necessarily for internal policies. Option D is incorrect because economic justification is a policy concern, not a legal requirement. This question highlights the distinction between binding rules and agency guidance. Question 26. While investigating a complicated issue between different stakeholders and administrative agency changes, a long-standing interpretation of a statute, what legal test determines whether the agency's reinterpretation is valid? A. The Our deference test. B. The Skidmore deference test. C. The State Farm reasoned decision-making test. D. The Chevron two-step test. Answer. D. The Chevron two-step test. Explanation. Under Chevron deference, Chevron U.S. ADC 1984, courts evaluate an agency's statutory interpretation using two steps. Step 1. Does this statute clearly address the issue? If yes, the court follows congressional intent. Step 2. If the statute is ambiguous, is the agency's interpretation reasonable? If yes, the court defers to the agency. Option is incorrect because our deference applies to an agency's interpretation of its own regulations, not statutes. Option B is incorrect because Skidmore deference applies to informal agency interpretations, giving them weight based on their persuasiveness. Option C is incorrect because the State Farm test applies to policy changes, not statutory interpretation. This question evaluates judicial deference to agency statutory interpretation. Question 27. While examining inconsistencies across various units, a federal agency updates its licensing requirements, tightening eligibility criteria. However, affected businesses argue that the agency's new rules conflict with prior guidance documents. What legal principle governs whether the agency must adhere to its prior guidance? A. The doctrine of equitable estoppel. B. The Accardi doctrine. C. The major questions doctrine. D. The arbitrary and capricious standard. Answer: B. The Accardi doctrine. Explanation: the Accardi doctrine from United States ex rel. Accardi v. Shaughnessy, 1954, holds that agencies must follow their own established rules and procedures. If an agency issues formal guidance and later contradicts it without proper justification, courts may strike down the inconsistency. Option is incorrect because equitable estoppel is rarely applied against government agencies, as it prevents private parties from asserting inconsistent positions. Option C is incorrect because the major questions doctrine applies to significant regulatory actions, not internal procedural consistency. Option D is incorrect because the arbitrary and capricious standard applies to general agency actions, but Accardi is specific to procedural fairness. This question examines an agency's obligation to follow its own rules. Question 28. During a comprehensive review of a process that needs improvement, a regulatory agency discovers that its past enforcement actions were based on an incorrect interpretation of the law. The agency now wishes to revise its approach but is concerned about potential lawsuits from those previously penalized. What principle determines whether past agency decisions can be overturned? A. Retroactive rulemaking. B. The principle of reliance interests. C. The exhaustion of administrative remedies. D. The presumption against judicial review. Answer: B. The principle of reliance interests. Explanation: when agencies change enforcement policies, courts evaluate whether affected parties reasonably relied on past interpretations. Under FCC v. Fox Television Stations 2012, agencies must consider reliance interests when changing positions. Option is incorrect because retroactive rulemaking is generally prohibited unless explicitly authorized by Congress. Option C is incorrect because exhaustion of remedies applies to whether a party must pursue all administrative appeals before litigation. Option D is incorrect because judicial review is generally allowed for significant agency policy shifts. This question focuses on legal constraints on agency policy changes. Question 29. In a situation where formal requirements conflict with practical realities, an agency mandates electronic submission of regulatory filings, but some stakeholders lack the necessary technology. How should the agency balance legal mandates with stakeholder concerns? A. Offer case-by-case exemptions based on undue hardship. B. Enforce the rules strictly regardless of challenges. C. Delay implementation indefinitely until all concerns are addressed. D. Allow regulated entities to submit in any format they choose. Answer: A. Offer case-by-case exemptions based on undue hardship. Explanation: agencies can offer limited exemptions when strict compliance creates undue hardship. Courts often recognize reasonable accommodations under administrative law, especially when compliance burdens disproportionately affect certain groups. Option B is incorrect because rigid enforcement without flexibility may be deemed arbitrary. Option C is incorrect because agencies cannot indefinitely delay rules without valid reasons. Option D is incorrect because uniform regulatory compliance is necessary for consistency. This question explores agency discretion in balancing regulatory requirements. Question 30. While updating traditional approaches where interconnections exist between multiple agencies, an intergovernmental task force struggles to enforce a new environmental policy due to overlapping jurisdictional claims. What legal principle should guide resolution of the dispute? A. The principle of cooperative federalism. B. The dormant commerce clause. C. The intelligible principle doctrine. D. The clear statement rule. Answer: A. The principle of cooperative federalism. Explanation: cooperative federalism refers to collaboration between federal and state governments in policy enforcement. Agencies should negotiate jurisdictional boundaries and establish clear enforcement mechanisms to avoid duplication and conflict. Option B is incorrect because the dormant commerce clause concerns state laws interfering with interstate commerce, not agency jurisdiction. Option C is incorrect because the intelligible principle doctrine applies to Congress delegating power to agencies, not jurisdictional disputes. Option D is incorrect because the clear statement rule applies to statutory interpretation, not interagency coordination. This question assesses knowledge of federal-state interactions in regulatory enforcement.